Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us in the second of our series of conversations with former state DOT secretaries. My name is Sophia Berger. I'm the National Lead for Transportation and Infrastructure with WSP, and I'm really pleased to be joined by three of my colleagues here today, Sean Wilson, Paula Hammond, and Davy Kim. And what we thought we would talk about for our second in this series is something very timely. What happens in crisis? How do DOTs or other state agencies react when there's a crisis that happens in our communities? And really, the example that's making us think about this is the terrible tragedy that happened in Baltimore a couple weeks ago now with the Francis Scott Key Bridge. I'm sure everyone on the line knows, but it collapsed in just a remarkable video that everyone has seen. It took the lives of 6 construction workers. It absolutely shut down a major waterway in front of a major port on the East Coast. It cut our arterial interstate network, and it just threw everyone into crisis mode. And so, we have to say the Maryland leadership is doing a remarkable job of immediately taking as much care and planning as they can to repair the situation, working with the federal government. So we're not really going to focus specifically on their project, but use that as an example to talk about what happens when there's this kind of unexpected crisis, this sudden thing that happens. And so to get it going, Sean, maybe I'll start with you. How do state agencies like Department of Transportation's plan for these unexpected events and know how to react?
Great question, Sophia. First, I will tell you, um, emergency response and crisis management is probably one of the things not listed in job descriptions across the country in many respects. But what agencies do, and agencies that I've worked with, we actually practice. Scenario planning is absolutely essential, and it kicks you into muscle memory gear. It gets you into a position of knowing exactly what you have to do, not because someone is telling you to do it, it just feels right. And so, as an agency, people would get frustrated as we would prepare for hurricanes or floods or tornadoes and have desktop exercises. But those are things that we actually do to understand what we have to do in a crisis, because when you act, believe it or not, there are huge financial implications, lives are on the line, and the ability to work together with other agencies and other jurisdictions could always come into question. And so you want to maintain communication, build muscle memory, and know exactly where your tools and resources are to best serve you and your constituents.
I think back, Sean, when you're mentioning those things, how much agencies practice and how it's at that emergency operation center table with other agencies and other partners that you develop those relationships. You never want to meet a first responder agency or delivery partner at the press conference when you're there with the governor to say, this is something bad happened. And what I think my biggest takeaway, my first day on the job as secretary in Washington, was when the Minnesota I-35 bridge fell down. And
Wow.
everyone in the governor's office turned to me and said, what are you going to do? And it reminded me that even though something happens far away, every DOT secretary in the country right then was looking at their bridges to know where they were vulnerable and what they had to say about the condition of their own bridges and structures. Not the case in the Baltimore situation, but it was something where you have vulnerabilities. People turn to you as the authority. And so having a communication strategy up the chain with your governor and being able then to tell them what needs to happen next from a transportation basis and keep that conversation and visibility of what you are doing visible with the public brings a lot of comfort.
One thing I'd like to say about preparation, I think most state agencies go through tabletop exercises, and they are really helpful because, as Sean said, you learn what to do in those kinds of major disastrous situations. At the same time, to use a sports analogy, practice is important, but it doesn't substitute for in-game situations. It's not the real thing, but you hope through practice, through repetitive practice, you have a good sense of what to do, and it's not brand new to you. You just have to apply it in a real situation. It's not pretend. It's not a tabletop exercise, but they are useful to do for sure.
And maybe, help our audience think about also what happens afterwards in a crisis too, right? I mean, it's not like the Maryland state authorities had a line item in their capital budget already with all the funds necessary to rebuild a major bridge, right? All of a sudden, you have this incredible need that you haven't planned for. What are the tools that state agencies rely on, and what do they do?
Well, and a great example of that in California is a segment of Highway 1 in Northern California called Devil's Slide.
Oh,
And this is
that was ominous.
yeah, a notoriously vulnerable stretch of Highway 1 right along the coast that has seen so many mudslides, floods, road is washed out. A section of Highway 1 is closed for months at a time. Immediate repairs are done. Long-term repairs are done. They have to be done all over again. And so it is a combination of state funds and a lot of federal funds through the FHWA's Emergency Relief Program. And so that's a classic example of infrastructure vulnerable to sea level rise and climate change, and it takes constant work. The job is never over. Um, Obviously, not the same as what happened in Baltimore, but it is vulnerable, and that's going to keep going for many more years to go. And it requires that partnership with the federal government to be able to fund those kinds of improvements.
We had a common statement in our DOT that everything touches everything. And one example of a disaster when we had Interstate 5 closed, the major north-south freight movement corridor, and all of our east-west mountain passes closed for avalanches, we didn't have a good sense of understanding how to move freight and goods, even medical emergency personnel, and the goods that are coming to grocery stores. We had this major state shutdown for over 7 days. And that's when we learned that we were weak in our knowledge of who our freight movers were and what our databases were. And the tools online weren't quite as good as they are today. But really understanding when you're in a position with a mess on your highway or on a bridge or in your routes, you have to recover everywhere for the economy to keep moving and communities to be served.
And Paul, a key to that is having constructive collaboration. When you think about the partnerships that you have to depend on, in the case of what we see in Baltimore, Paul, the secretary or commissioner there, is working with all sorts of federal agencies, but they're also working with local jurisdictions. And I can look back to hurricanes and floods, and where we prepared with Mississippi for contraflow, we actually worked with them afterwards to manage traffic, to provide information to travelers in another state before they even came to Louisiana. We did the same thing in Texas when Beaumont and was unable to access their constituents. It was easier for Louisiana to go over there and evacuate people. So having a relationship with other CEOs, with other agencies across jurisdictions, horizontally and vertically, will make a huge difference in terms of an ability to be successful. And that's before you get into this issue of resilience and making sure you repair it in ways that it won't break again, that you've learned from the flood, you've learned from the slide where possible. And as Davey said, sometimes you just can't make it more resilient because we can't beat Mother Nature. But the reality is we think about those things in a disaster. How do we work to not have this happen again anytime soon? And so that's a big part of what happens after a disaster.
Well, I think that's a great note for us to end on, Sean. How do we make sure this never happens again? Which is what all of this scenario planning and practice is all about, to limit, the impact of these kinds of crises and disasters. So thank you for the three of you. That was super interesting and really helpful and reassuring to know how much these agencies prepare and think about these scenarios and plan ahead for it. So thank you, and hope to see everyone again on our next session of this Speaking with Secretaries from State Agencies in Motion. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.